Welcome to the Critical Media Studies Podcast. We're your hosts, Mike Rapici
and Barry Falk.
Dr. Michael Rapici, how are you today?
I'm good, Barry. How are you doing?
I was so eager to speak.
I know.
I just sort of ran right over you. This is what we do on the internet here. Here we go.
It's fine. It's fine. How are you today?
I'm doing well, considering my city is in ruins. But
yeah. Mine's on deck. Well, it's good to see you. Today we are, the world doesn't end. We're going to talk about an article from the New York Times, or not the New York Times, excuse me, from the New Yorker, in their April 17th, 24 issue called "The Internet's New Favorite Philosopher" by a man named Kyle Chayka. This is a discussion of Byung-Chul Han and his
one of our stable, what do we call them? Patron saints, stable people, pantheon.
I don't know that I would say that he's necessarily our guy, but he's certainly, I guess, directing this to the audience, he certainly seems to be your guy. The episode that we did on Han has
you're meeting the audience.
Yes, has absolutely outpaced all of the other. It's almost as if people want to talk about Han. People want to listen to other people talk about Han. And
well, this article kind of explains that.
That's
right?
And
everybody apparently
loves Byung-Chul Han.
It's on Google searching for anything that talks about Byung-Chul Han and the internet.
And that's what Mr. Chayka does. He I guess the general thrust of the article is he talks, there's the biographical sketch of Han and how he came into academia and what he writes about. But
how about Michael, not to interrupt you, but actually I think it might be worth, in terms of setting the episode up for listeners, I think I'm going to read one or two sentences for the biography, because I think that is kind of relevant here.
Sure.
Born in 1959, that's kind of relevant because that means that Mr. Han is kind of close to my age, and therefore, according to Mr. Young, Kyle Chayka, kind of over the hill, kind of dated, kind of, this point, out of touch. No. Like any 60-year-old would be, a little bit out of touch. I mention this only because this probably is going to be a point that we're going to raise later, because Mr. Chayka does. But I wanted to give the biography. Go ahead and comment. Go ahead.
No, well, I was just initially sort of I wouldn't say he's out of touch. I think there's some interesting contradictions, and that's sort of what Chayka brings out here about Han's work that might be symptomatic of his age, but
very nice, very
perhaps
nice.
Not.
As when Michael, when did Mr. Punk Rock become Mr. Politic? You're like that was such a politic statement there. Didn't you used to listen to Bad Religion and Minor Threat? What's going on here?
Yeah, I don't know.
With my co-host,
I don't know.
Barry Falk wonders. Okay, back to the bio, because I think
born in 59.
Born in 1959, and the important thing, I think, is the academic. I just want to make one point about his academic credentials, but also another point about his academic. First point: studied philosophy, got a PhD from the University of Freiburg, which is no slouch for a philosophy department. Studied Martin Heidegger. This is important because I think one of the illuminating points that Chayka makes is that I think he makes this sort of covert argument, but very convincing argument, that the best way to understand Byung-Chul Han, even though he, of course, is the internet's favorite philosopher, and we would associate him with theorists of technology, and of course, Martin Heidegger is par excellence a theorist of technology, but Chayka convinces me that there is a way in which Byung-Chul Han is a little bit of a man out of time, and that I think there are references to Heidegger. Chayka makes references to Han, and also to Heidegger, and also to Jean-Paul Sartre.
Mm-hmm.
There is and this is what I mean by being a little bit out of time. Chayka, in this portrait of Han, I get the sense, or at least Chayka convinces me, that Han is kind of a throwback to another age, to an older age, that post World War II age. And Heidegger was part of this as well,
Right.
where when existentialism was all the rage in philosophical circles, because existential philosophy, unlike other philosophies, had a language in which to talk about anxiety, care. That's
Mm-hmm.
one of Heidegger's big terms. Concern, care, anxiety, unease, despair,
Mm-hmm.
sickness unto death, Kierkegaard's term. So there's a way in which, um, curiously enough, Han is making old things new again. There's a way in which he's the internet's favorite philosopher, partly because we're due for another sort of resurgence of existentialism. And he's kind of built for that. So I'll just finish reading this. Began teaching phenomenology, aesthetics, and religion, kind of a man out of time, right? Eventually landing at the Berlin University of the Arts. And then he just sort of became, final point on this. Around 2017, he started becoming a one-man press, and he writes. Maybe we're going to talk about the form of his books. They're always short. Maybe I will say something about that as well. And since I'm sort of taken the role of sort of describing not just Han and his intellectual profile, but something about his intellectual projects. So biography, trained in philosophy, and maybe concerned with some old style kind of philosophy, old style philosophy that was concerned with the individual, focuses on individual and care and therapeutic concerns for the individual. So that's the first point of it. The second point of it is this the interesting idiosyncrasy or singularity of his writing style. Beginning in 2017, no, I think it's even earlier, right? Or is it 2017?
I think it's 17.
2017. He became a kind of one-man printing press via Polity, where he writes very short books. This is really much a key to his success. Short books with short chapters. They're kind of pamphlets rather than tomes of philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
They're kind of pamphlets on philosophy. They're not quite memes. They're more substantial than memes, but they're memeable.
Me, that was exactly the word I was going to use.
They're memeable, and so there is this way in which his themes are themes of concern, anxiety, dread, that seem to circulate very easily through the internet, there seems to be an internet audience for self-help,
Mm-hmm.
especially for anyone who can assist us to get through the anxieties of everyday life. So there is a particular theme that he's come across, that he's hit upon, that translates well to this global audience. And there's also something significant and interesting about the form of his books. They're short, they're not quite epigrammatic, but they're memeable. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
much
No,
too
I
much.
think no, I
Yeah.
think that's right. I mean, and I think all of that gets to. So Chayk is doing, I think, a couple things with the article. One, if you put Byung-Chul Han's name on something, as we've seen, people are going to read it. People are going to look at it, right? So I think part of his job or his intent here is to say, hey, let's take a look at what's happening and why it's happening. And as a necessary part of that, we have to talk about, well, who is the man, right? But what's interesting, I think, about this is his second sort of, how do I want to say this? His maybe a secondary intent here is to look at the nuts and bolts of what Han is doing. And in doing this, he references, or he cites a man, Pigeon. Um,
Mr. Pigeon is the smartest PhD student at the University of
he is
Oxford.
certainly one of them. I want to get his name here because I really appreciated, um,
Mr. Pigeon, we're fans.
without
Please text
question.
us,
Um,
message us,
but God,
like, sustain,
this is terrible.
subscribe.
Charles Pigeon, a doctoral student at the University of Oxford, points out some sort of contradictions or inconsistency with what Han's doing. But before we get into that, You said a lot of stuff that's really interesting, and one of them, just as a means of sort of getting our footing here, is that Han is sort of working on this return to existentialism, right?
Essentialism, yeah.
And and I think that it makes sense, right? Like the internet, which is at this point everywhere and everything, has created an entirely new context for us. And it's a short form context. So his approach makes a ton of sense, right? Like in essence, he's become sort of like the bullet point philosopher, right? Everything is memeable, everything is easily digestible. Chayka even goes on to say that you don't read Han cover to cover. You just what did he say? You read Han like you read the Bible, right? You
Yes,
sort of
right,
just
right,
open up, find a verse,
right.
read it, and spend some time uh in whatever line
So not only are these not philosophical tomes, these are not, he studied Heidegger,
Mhm.
but he didn't write Being in Time. Byung-Chul
Nope.
Han is not about writing Being in Time. He's about it. So not only are these short and with incredibly brief chapters, they're not meant to be consumed with this sort of, they're not meant to be studied with care in the way that you would have to do it like a, what's his name, not what's his name, the great dear departed Hubert Dreyfus,
Uh-huh.
Herbert Dreyfus, Hubert or Herbert, I'm sorry, Mr. Dreyfus, um,
Hubert.
but he did a line by line commentary of Being in
Yeah,
Time, right?
no.
Yeah, I mean, this isn't,
Han
that
Han
isn't
is
how you read him,
Han is
right?
very much for the TikTok generation.
Right.
And I think goes that goes a long way in explaining at one point. Um, Chayka mentions that academics have not fully embraced Han. He's as good as any for the time being. But
Right,
I
right.
think all of this is maybe preamble to saying that he is, in my opinion, and I think you'll agree with me,
Hmm.
a fantastic case study um, in in uh, in our dear friend, patron saint of the show, Marshall McLuhan's notion that the medium is the mass age or the message. I mean, he is very much. I think his work and his thinking, his focus is very much in line with the medium through which he is consumed. And I think that's really a fascinating thing. And I hope, Barry, a good place to start actually digging into what's going on.
I like it. Do you want to continue, or do you want to since you're on a roll and you're talking about let me just because I don't want to do disrespect to the dead, especially to a great scholar. His name is Hubert Dreyfus, and
Yes.
he the one who did the lengthy commentary on Mr. Heidegger. Point being, and I mentioned that point because Heidegger is a philosopher who can justify, like Hegel. I mean, like there are philosophers in the tradition who can justify line by line exegesis because of the complexity of their work, or at least, and people complain about it and other people respond positively. Like it or not, even though there is something that is Heidegger-ish about Byung-Chul Han,
Hmm.
um, he is writing in a very different style, and the singular style of Byung-Chul Han is part of what we're talking about. Okay, do you want to take a stab at the form content issue and how? Okay, let me say this about the form content issue. We now want to talk about how McLuhan's form content issue, we think, applies, and we think this is kind of implicit in Chayka's argument, that the form content distinction that's so helpful in Marshall McLuhan can also assist us here in understanding why Byung-Chul Han is the internet's favorite philosopher. But I would say, Michael, that it's a kind of different. Usually we talk about the ways, well, let me take a stab at it, and then then you're going to correct me.
Yeah, well, we'll see.
Yeah, well, I'm just going to take a tentative stab, and it's just a tentative foray, and then, I want to open it up to you. I don't want to hog the time. Okay. So usually when we make use of patron saint McLuhan's form content distinction, we use it in a particular way. We say something like this. I mean, this is typically this is the critical media studies move that we make Empowered by McLuhan. We're focusing on a program that, say, is about religious programming on the internet. And our interpretive term, enabled by McLuhan, will say something like this. Hey, I know the listener, or I'm sorry, I know the podcaster, I know the content provider thinks they're talking about religion. They think the content is the all-important thing in the message. And the medium that is communicating the message and dispersing the message is not as important as the content or themes of the message. McLuhan tells us that, on the contrary, the structure of the media structure is filtering, is transforming the content as the content is being transmitted throughout the world. Okay. So I guess so that's how we usually apply this move.
Mm-hmm.
Now, as I understand it, Michael, we want to apply this move. We want to make this move, the CMS move. We want to make the move to Han, but it seems like in our pre-discussion, we have to modify it somewhat. And so I'm going to try to modify it, and you tell me whether you agree.
Yeah.
My modification would go something like this. This is what Chayka basically tells us, and that there is something actually not about the content, something about, or maybe this is the McLuhan thing, but let me just phrase it now, because I'm anxious to throw it to you to sort of clarify the mess I'm making. I think Chayka's argument is that there is something about the themes and content of Byung-Chul Han's philosophy. This idea that the internet, we're wedded to it, but it necessarily degrades communication and therefore is a cause of despair. There is something about the therapeutic, there's something about his themes, Han's themes of therapy, self-cure for the internet addicted. There is something about that content that actually gets magnified and is perfectly suited for the format of the internet. So the poison of the internet, in Han's words, is actually what makes the poisonous element of the internet, what Han would call the poisonous element of the internet, is ironically what makes Byung-Chul Han the hottest philosopher on the internet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that one of Chayka's points, and he does this through citing Pigeon, is that there is a contradiction or an irony, right? That, and he uses the campfire as his metaphor here, right? That the what Han can't see or chooses to not see, or somewhere between the two, is that for all of the bemoaning the internet and the arguments about how it is alienating and enervating, etc., that this has become the dominant form of expression, and this has become the mode through which we can do these things. It's a very, as you and I have talked about, this is pharmacological, right? Like the poison is the cure. This is, so there's implicit in that is the irony, right? Han is sitting here writing about these things, but his rise to fame is a
Is
result of
enabled by the
is enabled
by the poison,
by the
by
poison
the
itself.
poison.
What's interesting to me about this, you think about the form shaping the content, or the form giving meaning to the content, I think is probably a better way of saying this, right? Like that, we appreciate Han as we do because he's writing about that very thing that we are all glued to. So it seems incredibly timely. But I think in a way, we're in a situation that I don't want to say it transcends McLuhan, because his argument still holds well.
Mm-hmm.
But this is, when McLuhan was talking about the medium and the message and the
Hmm.
medium and the mass age, because, there's a distinction to be made between the mass and the message. The thing that made that really work was that there
Hmm.
was an alternative, right? You
Hmm.
could listen to radio and there were still other means of
Hmm.
consuming
Hmm.
information. There were other ways of being, right?
Hmm.
Han's writing about a situation where what does discussion look like outside of the internet? What does non-media, let me change that actually. Just what does non-mediated discussion look like? It's non-existent, So this gets back to the argument, not the argument, the sort of the point you made earlier about this return to existentialism. The context is so radically changed that I wonder if this, I don't want to say it, that this observation of an apparent contradiction or irony in Han
Hmm. Hmm.
isn't just the cost of doing business. If this isn't just like it,
Wow. Wow, Michael.
is it possible that there's another way to do this? I mean,
Is it possible of avoiding this irony that Mr. Chayka? There's a little bit of snark. And let me tell you
there's
something
a
really.
ton of snark.
Well, okay. Well, you said ton. Okay. Uh, I think that's worth remarking on because uh, that's worth remarking on because there is a snark factor to this article. And your point, it's a really sensitive. Again, Mr. Minor Threat has become not only a placater in politics, you become very sensitive. I think that's a very sensitive question, and very sympathetic. By sensitive, I mean
Mhm,
sympathetic
mhm.
to Han question, because I think that is what allows Chayka to be snarky is the sense, well, Han's doing this, and
Right.
he could do otherwise. But I think you're right. And actually, I think this would be one criticism maybe that we could justifiably lodge against Mr. Chayka's very smart article is that I think you're right. Um, the cost of doing everything changes when the internet is the only game in town. And if that means that one has to do philosophizing in a way that's similar, maybe not in the exact way that Mr. Han is doing, but in a similar way. That's just the cost of doing business, is how you said it. And I wonder if Chayka is maybe a little, some of his snark comes from the idea that Han is kind of, I'll get back to this point, out of touch and is being ironically appropriated without realizing it. But maybe this is a little bit more of maybe this is a more tragic situation. Maybe this is something that would happen to anyone in some form, if one is trying to become an internet philosopher.
Well,
Let me end by saying just something, we've been talking about existentialism. I was thinking about this in preparation for the episode, Michael. So let's say, and I almost said this earlier in the episode, let's go ahead and be Chayka-like and criticize Byung-Chul Han for being Heidegger light.
mhm.
Okay. Okay, yeah, Heidegger light. Ooh, ha, burn, burn. On the other hand, this is something that occurred to me. Did Heidegger ever work at Heidegger's situation? And he also became a global phenomenon as a philosopher. I mean, it's a completely different situation. His circulation can't compare, I would think, to Byung-Chul Han's.
Mm-mm.
It can't compare. So that suggests this sort of game-changing thing that I think is really brilliantly implicit in your question.
Well, it's an interesting thing to think about because again, if we get down to context, like so Chayka is sort of, and I like the article, and I don't find I think that as I understand what he's doing, it makes sense and it's well done. But it seems to me that part of the slight against Han is like, oh, you're sort of like the people's philosopher or the people's academic. And that's why academia is not taking you seriously because you are the TikTok guy. And that's where discussions about you are being had. and your books are 100 pages. They're not 400 pages. And I can read one line of your work and get
Wow.
the gist of it. Whereas if I go back to Heidegger, I'm going to spend 3 weeks trying to figure out what one line even means before I can even start to try and make connections and applications to it, right? Like the density of something like Heidegger is overwhelming. And, we live in a time where we don't have time to be overwhelmed, right? We live in this and I think this is sort of Han's um
So
a
it's
realization.
everyone's dilemma. It's not just Han's dilemmas.
No,
That's
no,
what
I
we're
wouldn't say it's
saying.
his dilemma. This is sort of his point. This is what he's
Yeah.
focusing on,
Oh,
right?
right, right, right,
Is that like,
right,
okay, so
right,
so he's in a way, you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. If you're going to
right,
try and take this as high philosophy or high theory,
right,
um, there just aren't that many people left to read that, right?
right, right,
So
right.
if you're going to dumb it down, well, okay, then maybe the people who fancy themselves as disciples of high philosophy are going to look down on that because, again, this is the form that you're trafficking in, right? You can't
Hmm.
I mean, I guess this brings to question, what's the validity, what's the value of content that is disseminated via these social media platforms, via
That's a
the
great
internet?
point.
Is it inherently less because it's structured differently? Because I think that it's not hard to imagine a world where, people sit down and have deep, meaningful discussions around this. I mean, it seems to me, based on the article and the commentary within the article, that that's part of his appeal, that this resonates with people. I think that it's just easy to get kind of cheeky when more people, when people can get past the gates.
Well, Michael, you raise a really interesting question, which is, like it or not, we live in a TikTok world. And the real question to wrestle with Byung-Chul Han is maybe not so much the form content problem or the ironies of his reception, but maybe the larger question that I think you're pointing us toward is, what is the value, if any, of Han and Han's writing and his writing practice in a TikTok world? Let me say that's a great question. Maybe I think that's a great question,
Mm-hmm.
maybe to end our discussion with. I wanted to say something. I wanted to harken back to an earlier discussion point before we get to that question, though, because in your discussion of in your case, as you were making the case for a sympathetic appraisal for Han, you made me think about the form content thing and how it might relate to Han's argument. And also, how Chayka is describing the function of Han or how Han gets appropriated. It seems to go something like this that, and I'm using your phrase here, that
Okay.
McLuhan's standard argument is that form creates meaning. And it does seem to be that Chayka is implying something slightly different from the typical McLuhan-esque interpretation that media form is a meaning generator. The irony seems to come from the irony that the ironic situation or structure that Chayka is illuminating seems to go something like this. It seems slightly different from McLuhan. It's that the meaning of Han's writing, his concerns for his writing about uh, his writing is an application of therapy cures for media overload. That ironically, there's something perfect for the form of the internet. The
Mm-hmm.
internet form loves to broadcast messages of despair, anxiety, self-help. Does that sound right?
I think so. I mean, those are the things that I think universally resonate, right? This is
Yeah.
why pathos trumps all things in terms of, eliciting response. I think that the value of Han is it's sort of like saying, well, what's the value of a particular tool? You know, I
Mm-hmm.
think what Han is doing is he's providing um, a language. He's providing an opportunity in a place where a lot of people exist and wouldn't typically have these discussions or these ideas. So the value, maybe what Han is doing is putting a little depth in a shallow pool, right? or at least creating a space where people are. There's a good and a bad to this, right? Like on one hand, I think that the potential problem is that we run the risk of watering down philosophy, we water down theory, we create a bunch of dilettantes who, but then I also have to ask, like, where's the real harm in that? You know, is it better to have people playing with important ideas, but maybe not playing with a high level of fluency, than to not have them playing at all? I mean, it's an interesting question, and I don't know that. I mean, we're going to find out. You know, we'll see how this shakes up. I think that the problem is that because of the medium, maybe we don't take them seriously. But
Or
then again,
academics don't. By we, particularly
by we, I think
academics,
we're people like you and me
intelligentsia,
yeah, you
right?
know, and who look at like, well, that came from TikTok. How seriously can I take you?
Right.
But on the flip side, I think there's sort of a utilitarian concept of this, and what he's doing is he's providing a language to address the unease that seems to be implicit in internet culture. And what better place to distribute that than the internet in the first place? So, you know, I don't know that you can necessarily take him as seriously as you could take Heidegger, perhaps, but I'm not convinced that that's not a mistake either.
Or that's a you know a horrible problem to have a horrible burden for the world, right?
Yeah, I don't. I mean,
Not be
I'm
Heidegger,
well. You
right?
know, I mean, that's the thing.
Or
It's
to
like,
not replicate Heidegger's density, or to not replicate Heidegger. Yeah,
but if these are
yeah,
universal problems,
right, right.
then it seems to me that that sort of density is more of an impediment than,
Absolutely.
you
And
know,
Heidegger, of course, gets criticized for that, right?
yeah. So I mean, I don't know. I think that it's not a bad thing. You know, I mean, if you don't like it, there's plenty of cat videos directly adjacent, I'm sure.
May I take a stab at
I
closing
absolutely,
comment?
absolutely.
Uh, well, first off, I have to praise you because you really, this was definitely one of the episodes where I came into the episode thinking one thing, and the our discussion has really kind of changed my mind.
Hmm.
In that I mostly wanted to end, I knew for the end point, I wanted to take Byung-Chul Han. I was going to use Chayka's article as an opportunity to take Byung-Chul Han to task for being too negative about internet possibilities and possibilities of community building through social media, and for being too much of a grumpy old man. And that's where I was going to go. And I was going to say that he was insufficiently, I was going to say, I was going to use Chayka to charge Byung-Chul Han for being insufficiently, to say that he's insufficiently pharmacological,
Hmm.
i.e., he isn't treating media as both a bad thing, crisis inducing, and crisis solution. So that's where I thought I'd be at the end of the
And
episode.
I think that's a fair criticism. I want to say I don't think
Yeah.
that any shift in the discussion here has invalidated that. I think that that's certainly there.
I but after our discussion, I'm going to end on a slightly different point. I'm glad you said that there's a point to that, and you know, I do think there's a point to that criticism that I was about to offer. But I don't want that to be my final word in light of our discussion, because what you were just saying convinces me that there is a positive function to the celebrity or the spectacle of Han's fame. And
Hmm.
and ironically, it's very Stiglerian. Thinking about how what you just said really convinced me of it. Um, I think that one of the functions of Byung-Chul Han's writing practice, and it is a very specific idiosyncratic writing practice, right?
Hmm.
You
Hmm.
know, he's writing and publishing his works. He takes care for the form of his works. His works have a very distinctive form. He is a craftsperson in that sense. Stiegler pays, it's not Stiegler, but Byung-Chul Han pays a great deal of attention to form. His books have a distinctive format, and style. They're heavily stylized, as well as having this sort of distinctive content. And I think you convinced me that it's the very form of his books that allows, even though he might be charged with being insufficiently pharmacological and non-Stiglerian, or but pushing against Stigler in that respect, there's a way in which the form of his books allows for a space of reflection on his readers. And I can't help but think that's a good thing.
Yeah. It's unconventional. It makes it, it stands out as something different, and something different is scary or suspect. But I think that
or difficult to assimilate, maybe.
That's probably best said. Yeah,
digest,
and hence the snark.
and hence.
And I don't. But and see, the thing is, I think it's important to say I'm not going to say that the snark is entirely unwarranted. I just think that he's just doing something different that looks like it should be very similar. You can't say, "Hey, I'm a Heideggerian, and I'm doing philosophy, and I'm going to write about it," but it's going to look different, and it might not be for the same audience that people who typically write Heidegger, that are comprised of people who read Heidegger. So I think that's what it is. But I think your point about opening up spaces for thought and doing so via a different form, perhaps
That strikes me as really Stiglerian.
Perhaps utilizing a different language, even. Certainly a different context, I think is I don't know, maybe he caught me in a sensitive moment here, but I think it's a good thing.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, this was a surprising discussion for me. This
it was. I feel like you and I have managed to talk about the internet in positive ways, and that in itself should be celebrated.
A little bit scary. A teaser for next episode. Yeah. One of the comments, one of the themes, Chayka does a very good job of this. He talks about Han's concern about narrative, about internet memes and internet content destroying our hunger or our understanding of narrative. And also Han's argument that only narrative can provide kind of existential meaning. We didn't get a chance to talk about that, but we're going to talk about it maybe in our next episode, where we will be revisiting really kind of the locus classicus of this particular argument about narrative, meaning, experience that Chayka and Han are referring to. It's an essay by Walter Benjamin called The Storyteller, and that will be the subject of our next podcast.
All right. Well, Barry, thank you.
Thank you, Michael. I really appreciate it.
All right. Take care.
Thanks for listening to the Critical Media Studies podcast. To find out more about the show, check out our webpage at criticalmediastudiespodcast.com.